That's it. It's over. 23 years, 6 World Cups, and it ends the exact same way it began, with Cristiano Ronaldo in tears on a football pitch. Portugal are out of the World Cup. Spain go through. And the man who spent 2 decades chasing the one trophy that never learned to love him back walks away from international football without it. Rough start to the day, I know, but that's football, and we're covering it every single day this tournament, so let's get into it. All right, coffee's next to me, cameras rolling, let's talk about what just happened to Ronaldo. Here's the setup nobody wanted to admit out loud. Portugal built their entire World Cup campaign around one idea: survive long enough, defend deep enough, and let one moment of magic from an aging legend decide it. For long stretches against Spain, that plan actually looked like it might work. Portugal sat back, absorbed pressure, and Spain, patient, probing, dominant in possession but short on real chances, couldn't find the breakthrough. And that's the cruel irony sitting underneath this entire match. The exact game plan that got Portugal this far is the same game plan that eventually killed them. A team that spends 90 minutes doing nothing but defending is a team 1 lapse away from disaster. It happened to other sides all tournament long. It was only a matter of time before it happened to Portugal too. Late in stoppage time it did. Spain's coach threw on 2 fresh legs, the 2 combined in seconds, and the ball was in the net. Game over. Dream over. And the cameras, because of course they did, cut straight to Ronaldo's face. Let's actually break down how it happened, because the goal itself tells you everything about why this Portugal side never had another gear to reach for. The introduction of 2 fresh attacking substitutes changed the geometry of the game instantly. Suddenly, there were extra bodies making late runs into pockets Portugal's exhausted backline simply didn't have the legs to track anymore. That's not bad luck. That's the mathematically predictable outcome of a team that spends 90-plus minutes purely surviving instead of managing tempo. When your only plan is, hold on, the other team gets to dictate exactly when the breaking point arrives. Spain simply waited until Portugal's concentration had nothing left to give, and then took it. And here's the part that stings if you were rooting for the Portuguese. For the 90 minutes before that goal, Ronaldo had barely touched the ball in any dangerous position. Not because he wasn't trying, because the entire structure of the team wasn't built to get him the ball in the first place. A team defending for its life doesn't have the possession share to feed a forward who needs service to do damage. So the cruelest version of this story isn't Ronaldo failed in his last World Cup match. It's that his own team's setup made sure he barely got the chance to succeed or fail on his own terms at all. You didn't need commentary for that shot. A grown man, arguably the greatest to ever play the sport, 40 years old, crying like the 18-year-old kid who first pulled on that Portugal shirt back in 2003. Because that's really what this was. Not just a loss. The final door closing on the only thing his trophy cabinet was ever missing. And here's the part that actually shook people, not the tears. Everyone expected the tears. What shocked the football world was what he said afterward. Ronaldo stood in front of the cameras, still visibly shaken, and instead of anger, instead of excuses, he gave what can only be described as a farewell speech to his own international career. He talked about giving everything for his country for over 2 decades. He said the tears weren't just heartbreak, they were relief too, because his conscience was clear. He said you can't fault a man for trying his absolute best. And on paper, that's a beautiful sentiment, genuinely. A legend closing the book with grace instead of bitterness. That's rare in football, where egos usually demand one more excuse, one more villain to blame. Most players in his position point at the referee, the tactics, the teammates. Ronaldo didn't. He just accepted it. But here's where I have to be honest with you, because that's the whole point of this channel. No sugarcoating. Something about those words doesn't sit right with me. Not because they're insincere. I think he meant every word. But because the logic underneath them is a little too convenient. You can't criticize someone who gave their all, sure, in a vacuum. But can you criticize a legend for staying on a plane past its landing time? For forcing a coaching staff to build an entire tactical identity around protecting one aging body instead of the team's natural game? That's the uncomfortable question nobody in that stadium was going to ask him out loud. Not on a night like that, not to his face. So call this a shocking quote if you want the headline version. I'd call it a graceful goodbye with a slightly convenient bit of self-editing baked into it. Both things can be true at once. That's football. That's legends. That's Ronaldo. And look, we have to talk about who was standing on the other side of that pitch, because the football gods clearly have a sense of drama. This wasn't just Portugal against Spain. This was, symbolically, the entire 20-year story of Ronaldo's career against the teenage face of the next one. A player barely out of his teens, already the best young talent on the planet, quietly dismantling a golden generation led by a 40-year-old icon in what was always going to be his final World Cup appearance, no matter the result. Nobody needed to say it out loud for everyone watching to feel it. The torch wasn't passed with a handshake or a hug at midfield. It was passed the way these things actually happen in real football. Brutally, silently, with one team walking off in tears while the other barely celebrates, because for them, this was just Tuesday. That's almost more poetic than if it had been staged. The future didn't arrive with fanfare. It just quietly won a football match and moved on to the next round, like it had somewhere better to be. It's worth saying plainly, none of this was personal. The young Spanish winger wasn't trying to end anyone's career. He was just doing his job, brilliantly, on a random Tuesday night, and the timing happened to align with the single most symbolic possible opponent. But symbolism doesn't care about intent. Once that final whistle went, the headlines wrote themselves, and they'll keep writing themselves for years every time these two are mentioned in the same sentence. Let's actually sit with what's being closed out here, because the scale of it is almost hard to process. 230-plus caps for his country. Over 140 international goals. A record that genuinely might never be touched by anyone, ever, in the history of the men's game. Appearances at 6 separate European Championships. Appearances at 6 separate World Cups. Nobody else in the history of the sport has that resume with a national team shirt on. And through every single one of those tournaments, there was always a piece missing. 2004, at home, in Portugal, as a teenager, losing a final to Greece that everybody assumed was already won. 2006, a semi-final exit. 2008, gone in the quarterfinals. 2012, gone in a semi-final on penalties. Every single time, one more step just out of reach. Then 2016 happened. And here's maybe the most poetic irony of his entire national team career. The night Portugal finally won something huge, a European championship, Ronaldo barely played in it. He got injured early in the final, left the pitch in tears, and ended up coaching from the touchline in a suit and a knee brace instead of playing. The trophy that defined his international legacy is one he mostly watched happen. Football has a strange sense of humor sometimes. 2 Nations League titles followed. Real trophies, doubted by plenty of pundits as lesser silverware, but trophies all the same. Proof that even deep into his 30s and 40s, he could still drag a team over the line in a final. But the World Cup? The one that actually matters to the history books? That one just never came. And now it never will. And of course, within minutes of the final whistle, the comparisons started flooding in. Because they always do, and honestly, they always will for the rest of both men's lives. His eternal rival got his World Cup. Years ago now, on a different continent, wearing a different shirt, with a redemption arc so complete it practically wrote its own movie script. That comparison isn't fair, and it isn't unfair either. It's just the reality of being the 2 best players of a generation who happen to have their international fortunes split so cleanly down the middle. Here's the distinction worth making, though, because it actually matters. One man got the fairy tale ending precisely because his team, in that specific tournament, in that specific year, was simply good enough and deep enough to carry him there. The other spent 2 decades captaining sides that were talented, sometimes even stacked, but rarely ever the best team in the world at the exact moment it counted. That's not entirely a reflection on either player individually. Football is a team sport, and World Cups are won by nations, not by individual brilliance alone, no matter how much individual brilliance either man brought to the table over the years. But try telling that to a comment section at 2 in the morning. Nuance doesn't trend. He never won it, and his rival did trends. So expect this comparison to follow him around for the rest of his life, fair or not. It's already following him around now. Predictably, the internet did what the internet does. Half the football world is mourning like they just lost a family member. The other half is pointing out, not unfairly, that Portugal's golden generation, stacked with players from Europe's biggest clubs, should arguably have gone further with or without a fading Ronaldo in the squad. Both reactions are valid. Both are happening at the same time, in the same comment sections, under the same clips of him crying. Journalists are already writing the obituaries for his international career. Former teammates are posting tributes. Rival fans, let's be honest, are posting a few laughing emojis they'll pretend they didn't post tomorrow. And somewhere in Spain, a stadium full of people are celebrating a team that, once again, quietly, efficiently, ruthlessly, ended a legend story without much fanfare at all. That's kind of Spain's whole identity at this tournament, by the way. Boring, efficient, and lethal exactly when it matters. Not a flashy way to make history, but an extremely effective one. Pundits, of course, are split straight down the middle, and honestly, watching them argue about it is almost more entertaining than the match itself. One camp is calling it the most dignified exit any all-time great has ever had. No excuses, no meltdown, no blaming the officials, just a quiet acceptance that the story is finished. The other camp is calling it exactly what I called it a minute ago, a beautifully worded way of avoiding the harder conversation about whether he should have even been out there in the first place. And the truth, like it usually does, probably sits somewhere in the middle of both arguments, which is exactly why nobody online is willing to just leave it there. What's been almost funnier to watch is the timeline of reactions. In the first 10 minutes after the final whistle, it was pure grief. Tribute edits, career montages, slow-motion replays of him walking off the pitch set to sad piano music. A couple hours later, the tone had already started shifting, with former players and ex-internationals weighing in on whether Portugal's system had quietly suffered for years trying to accommodate one man's role on the pitch. By the next morning, it had fully split into two furious camps who, at this point, aren't even really talking about the same match anymore. One side arguing about legacy, the other arguing about tactics, both convinced they're the only reasonable ones in the room. But the reaction split runs deeper than just sad fans versus happy rivals. There's a whole third camp forming online right now, and it's arguably the loudest one, people arguing this was actually the right outcome for the sport itself. Their logic goes like this. A World Cup decided by a story instead of the best team on the day would have been a worse outcome for football long term, however emotionally satisfying it might have felt in the moment. Sentiment makes for great highlight reels. It's a terrible way to decide who actually deserves to lift a trophy. That take is getting absolutely buried in replies from people calling it heartless, but it's not going anywhere. And if I'm honest, it's not entirely wrong either, even if it's a brutal thing to say out loud 12 hours after watching a grown man cry on live television. Meanwhile, pundits are doing what pundits always do after a moment like this, retroactively finding the exact substitution, the exact tactical tweak, the exact minute where it all went wrong, as if hindsight wasn't doing 90% of that analysis for them. Half of them predicted a comfortable Portugal win before kickoff. Funny how confident everyone suddenly is after the final whistle. Ronaldo's exit doesn't just close a chapter for him, it forces open a very uncomfortable question for the entire Portuguese federation. What does this team look like without him? Because for the better part of 2 decades, every single tactical conversation about the national team started and ended with one name. Now that conversation has to start from zero. There's genuine talent waiting in the wings, plenty of it, spread across some of the biggest clubs in the world. But talent isn't the same as identity, and Portugal hasn't had to build an identity without Ronaldo at the center of it since he was a teenager himself. That's the real story hiding behind the headline. Not just legend retires in tears, but entire footballing nation has to figure out who they are without him. That's a much harder rebuild than most people are giving it credit for right now. Think about it practically for a second. Formation choices, substitution timing, even where the wide players are told to run, all of it, for years, has been quietly shaped around keeping one specific man happy and central to the attack. Remove that variable, and suddenly the coaching staff has actual freedom for the first time in a generation. That could be terrifying for Portugal. It could also, weirdly, be the best thing that ever happens to this squad's ceiling. Plenty of nations have gone through exactly this kind of transition before. A golden individual retires, and the team either collapses without their crutch or discovers it was actually better balanced all along. Which version of that story Portugal becomes is genuinely an open question right now, and I don't think anyone, Federation included, actually knows the answer yet. There's also the psychological piece, which people tend to underrate. For over 2 decades, every single player who's pulled on that captain's armband has done so knowing there was a bigger name in the room. Now, for the first time in a very long while, whoever gets handed that armband next is inheriting it clean. No shadow, no comparison, no, well, it's not the same without him, hovering over every performance. That's pressure of a completely different kind, and how the next generation handles it will say a lot about whether this rebuild takes 2 years or 10. Think about how other nations have handled this exact transition. Some managed it smoothly because the process happened gradually, over several tournament cycles, with a clear successor easing into the role while the veteran was still around to mentor from the bench. Portugal doesn't get that luxury. This wasn't a gradual fade into a super sub role over a few years. It was a hard stop, in real time, on the biggest stage there is, with no announced succession plan and no obvious single heir to the captaincy or the tactical identity he leaves behind. That means the next coach walks into one of the more unusual jobs in international football right now. A genuinely stacked roster with real quality in almost every position, but zero established hierarchy at the very top of the team. Whoever takes this job doesn't inherit a rebuilding project in the traditional sense. The talent is already there. What's missing is the 20-year-old certainty of knowing exactly who the team is built around. That's a strange kind of problem to have. Most nations would trade instantly for too much talent, unclear identity, over clear identity, not enough talent. But it's a real problem all the same, and it'll take at least one full tournament cycle to sort out properly. So here's where I actually land on all of this, for what it's worth. And again, I'm just a guy behind a camera with opinions, not a Ballon d'Or voter. The tears were real. The heartbreak was real. 23 years of chasing one trophy and walking away empty-handed is a genuinely tragic sports story, no matter which side of the rivalry you're on. But the quotes afterward, the "you can't criticize someone who tried their best" line, that's the part of the story people are going to be talking about for a while, and honestly, it deserves the scrutiny it's getting. Legends get to write their own ending. That's earned. But the rest of us still get to ask the questions the moment made too emotional to ask on the night. That's not disrespect. That's just football being football, even for the greatest of all time. Either way. Say what you want about the man, the ego, the numbers, the debates that'll rage for years about him versus his eternal rival. Nobody, and I mean nobody, will ever question whether Cristiano Ronaldo gave this sport absolutely everything he had. Tears and all. And that's the story for today, friends. Thanks for watching. Thanks for being here every single day this tournament. It means more than you know. Like the video if it hit you the way it hit me writing it. I'll be back tomorrow with more of this chaos. Until then, peace to your homes and I'll see you again soon.